Stranger Things. Season 5 lands at a strange moment. Audience may see it as the end of a chapter, but for Winona Ryder, it's a historical return. She stepped into fame way before the industry knew how to manage it. She lived through a rise that moved too fast, a public correction that cut too deep, and a long stretch away from the spotlight that was never explained. Now she is here again, not as a reinvention or redemption, but as someone who understands what fame takes before it gives anything back. How does Winona Ryder survive fame, fracture, and re-entry? Why does her presence in Stranger Things, Season 5, feel heavier than nostalgia? Let's figure out. Winona Ryder literally became symbolic early. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, she was framed as a cultural signature, intelligent, alternative, serious, and fragile.
You know, one minute she wanted to be a nun, and the next minute she wanted to have sex with somebody, and the next minute it was something else. And she felt bad about that, but she didn't, that's what happens with teenagers, is they feel guilty for having completely normal feelings.
Besides promoting her work, the industry projected meaning onto Winona. Psychologically, that leaves a huge impact. When recognition accelerates faster than personal boundaries, identity starts forming unnaturally. Choice is narrow, and experimentation becomes risky because the public begins to expect consistency from someone who is still figuring out who they are. Winona entered that system completely unprotected. There was no modern conversation about exposure, mental bandwidth, or recovery cycles. Visibility was continuous, and there was hardly anyone to manage it for Winona. Gradually, her profile continued to grow. So did the gap between who she was allowed to be publicly and who she could explore privately.
Stranger Things, but this award from you who take your craft seriously and earnestly believe, like me, that great acting can change the world is a call to arms from our fellow craftsmen and women to go deeper and through our art to battle against fear, self-centeredness, and exclusivity of our predominantly narcissistic culture, and through our craft to cultivate a more empathetic and understanding society by revealing intimate truths.
That gap created tension, and over time, that tension took the shape of strain. Her rise collapsed under velocity. The pressure of meaning-making somehow outpaced the ability to integrate it. By the time media scrutiny intensified, her identity was already carrying more than it was designed to hold. That's the first cue to understanding her later withdrawal. It was a system hitting its limits, and once that limit is reached, the next phase silently starts. Once fame crosses a certain threshold, internal pressure becomes a concern. According to psychology books, constant evaluation changes how the mind allocates effort. Research on social evaluative threat, particularly by Dickerson and Kemeny, shows that sustained judgment activates stress response, even in the absence of immediate danger. The body reacts as if it is always being assessed. Over time, this leads to a change. People start anticipating scrutiny before it arrives. Studies on self-conscious emotions, including work by June Tangney, show that repeated exposure to judgment increases self-monitoring and reduces spontaneity. Behaviors become pre-edited, and the self starts managing risk.
People feel shame, guilt, and pride and embarrassment when they reflect upon themselves, when they evaluate themselves against some internal standards or some societal standards. So the point here is that when people experience these self-conscious emotions, they are both the evaluated and the evaluator.
For celebrities, this pressure compounds because here, visibility is not episodic, but ambient. Winona Ryder's fame bloomed in an era where exposure was unbuffered. There were no mechanisms to modulate attention, nor was there any cultural language for burnout. Stepping back was framed as disappearance. Under such conditions, research in stress psychology points to a predictable outcome: identity strain. When the demands of presentation exceed the capacity for integration, withdrawals become the new regulation. This connects to control theory in psychology. When individuals perceive that outcomes are no longer influenced by actions, disengagement increases. What looks like retreat is often the nervous system reducing overload. Seeing through that lens, Winona's absence reads differently. It was a refusal to let visibility permanently restructure her inner life. And that distinction is important because it explains why her return didn't happen quickly or loudly. Re-entry after overexposure is about rebuilding conditions that won't recreate the same damage. That's the challenge her comeback had to meet.
I know that a lot of people have discovered that they're like on the spectrum, or, you know, and I kind of remember, like I remember Anthony Hopkins.
Yes.
And Dan Aykroyd and Annie Lennox. Just, I think I'm like of the generation where it was just called life.
What happened next is usually described as a fall. Psychology tells an unspoken story. When public narratives turn, they never ask why something happened. Instead, they ask who to assign it to. Fritz Heider's attribution theory explains this theory. Humans instinctively explain complicated events by locating an individual's responsibilities. That's how public corrections work. The behavior that once read as depth or sensitivity starts to read as instability. Context disappears, and structural pressure goes unseen. The story collapses into a single-liner narrative of personal failure. This shift was especially sharp for Winona Ryder. Her public image was mostly built on emotional gravity and seriousness.
I'm liberal, but I'm conservative with myself. I can't look at me. I'm tiny. One drink and I'm on the floor.
However, when strain invaded, it violated expectations and attracted harsher judgment than excess ever does. Psychological research on labeling effects, particularly in social stress studies, says that when an individual gets redefined publicly, their future behavior also gets interpreted through that level. Neutral actions become suspect, while recovery becomes invisible. Many careers break there. Robert Sapolsky's stress physiology research breaks down why this phase is too destabilizing. Prolonged exposure to uncontrollable stress exhausts the body and narrows behavioral range. This further results in cognitive flexibility drop. At this stage, emotional responses flatten or unpredictably spike. In such conditions, continued exposure turns corrosive. What's important here is what didn't happen. Winona never attempted to counter the narrative immediately. Neither she over-explained, nor did she perform repair. She kept on engaging with the stressor continuously, which resulted in prolonged dysregulation. This reframes the so-called fall. It was a system reaching saturation and a person stepping out of it. This leads to a critical distinction. Some people disappear because they lose relevance. Others disappear because they refuse to let relevance finish them. That difference defines what came next. Stepping away from fame doesn't guarantee spontaneous damage repair. However, it definitely creates the conditions for repair. Psychological research on recovery from disruption claims that resilience has never been about quickly bouncing back. It always revolves around the idea of reorganizing life away from the original stressor. George Bonanno, a clinical psychologist known for his work on resilience, found that long-term recovery often depends on reduced exposure and the absence of performative pressure. In simpler words, healing requires privacy. Winona Ryder's absence was not passive but structured. She removed herself long enough for public expectations to deliberately lose urgency. This matters because identity repair takes place off stage. Research on self-concept repair shows that people need periods where behavior is not constantly evaluated in order to regain internal coherence. Change remains cosmetic without that space. Another relevant framework comes from Hobfoll's conversation of resource theory. It briefs how individuals recover by protecting psychological resources, including emotional energy, control, and attention. Continuous exposure drains those resources faster than they can regenerate. Winona's time away worked as resource protection, and that's why her return was never an urgent one. She didn't want to reappear just for the sake of a narrative correction. Instead, she waited, let the narrative become neutral, and came back. That's where Stranger Things comes into play, not as a rescue, but as a structure. Did you know why most comebacks fail? Well, they do because they mostly recreate the same environment that caused the exit. The role is too symbolic, or maybe the attention is too concentrated, while expectations are too personal. But Stranger Things didn't put Winona into that cycle. It never worked as a star-centric vehicle built around her identity. It wasn't an ensemble. Attention was distributed, and no single actor carried the weight of meaning. That alone reduces psychological load. Second, the role itself was crowded. Joyce Byers is practical, ordinary, and resilient. This character doesn't demand symbolic performance, but it definitely calls for presence. This difference is crucial.
Telling you, and I'm just gonna. That is not.
You. Contact. Doc Clark.
Joyce! What the hell are you doing?
I need to borrow these.
No, you're not going back there. And this is a state government.
Sometimes re-entry after prolonged withdrawal looks safer, especially when roles have distinct boundaries and limited identity overlap. Joyce allowed Winona to work without reactivating the old associations that once defined her. There's a third factor as well. The platform changed the contract. Netflix-era fame operates differently from the 1990s system. Here, scheduled promotion and managed exposure are norms. There's no constant chase for relevance. This environment creates a protected re-entry environment. That said, Winona returned to a system that absorbed her without consuming her. Her comeback feels steady, not dramatic. The audience can clearly sense alignment. However, when re-entry reaches a stable ceiling, the relationship with fame changes. Can you pause for a while and think about how impactful that change could be? Drop your answer in the comments. Earlier, fame used to demand availability, but that contract is no longer alive. Today, selectivity defines it. Winona appears to respond to the call of work. The demand for attention has hardly anything to do here. She never attempted to manage perception in real time. Psychologically, this talks about a shift from identity-seeking to identity-protecting behavior. Adult development studies show that when individuals regain internal coherence, they become less motivated by external validation. Fame becomes a condition to manage. This is why Winona's presence now feels steady. She is using structure to prevent overexposure. That difference changes everything. The work speaks, then recedes. There's no fragile persona to defend or any performance relevance to maintain. That is why Season 5 is not a victory lap. It brings Winona's silver screen journey full circle. Winona Ryder closes a long, unfinished loop with the final season of Stranger Things. Her journey shows that surviving fame is about knowing when to step back and how to return without losing yourself again. Does this explanation change your mindset about Winona's presence in Season 5? If yes, don't hesitate to share this video. Subscribe to Fame Files to learn what happens to people when the spotlight moves on.